Good morning. It is very exciting to be here. I've been an attendee at PHP UK for many years. I've been a speaker a few times too. Today I'm your keynote. I think it's the first time I've given a talk here that doesn't have code in it. And I am very excited to share this with you. So hi, I'm Lorna. I work at Ivan. We do open source databases as a service. Please feel free to talk to me about databases. But today I'm here to talk to you about open source. The slides and all of the links that I didn't put in the slides because that's a weird place for links, you can find at this URL. If I'm good at tech, I've just tweeted it. And I'll share this again at the end as well. My topic is open source and business. It's also about where we fit into those two things that can seem a long way away from everyday developers and everyday engineers. The overlap between open source and business is something I don't think we're looking at enough. But there are lots of things that can work for both parties, and that overlap is magical, and we are absolutely there, where those two concerns join. Let's start by talking about open source. I want to be a bit formal about how we talk about open source. I don't mean you can also view the source code. Hey, I made a thing and it is on GitHub. It's not open source. There's a formal definition of open source, and there are 10 directives with which everything must comply. I won't read them to you, but the important thing is that your code must have a license, and that license must be an OSI, Open Source Initiative, approved license. Otherwise, it might be an awesome project, and I'm not criticizing it, but it is open core or source available. It is not truly open source. So look out for open washing when you're choosing your software. I think the definition is important because open source is about more than the code. Yes, you get the code. Yes, you can use it. The open source definition doesn't allow discrimination against persons or groups. So you can't stop a particular company or other subgroup of humans from using your code. You can't stop them from using it to make money either. You can't discriminate against fields of endeavor. You cannot stop someone from taking your open source code and running it in a way you disagree with. Open source is about code, but it's also about freedom. You get more than just the code when you choose an open source project. So where does business fit in? Well, the way I think about this is that business has really two main priorities in what they do: innovation and security. Businesses must innovate to survive. I think open source is a natural fit because it's crowd innovation. We publish and share components that we can build on. So every business shares those components and can build on top of it. We know that business uses open source. There was some open source UK research last year that said that 89% of UK businesses use open source. Why do they do that? Because it's good for them, because they see the benefits. When you need to innovate, open source lets you move quickly and lets you take the advantages, the fixes, and the updates from the wider community. And you don't need to build all of it yourself. Hopefully you're building some of it yourself, but we'll get to that. Businesses care about security, and we expect them to care about security. We trust them with our data. Open source security is best of breed because we are like mob secure, right? We all care about the security of the components that we use. We all audit and care about these things. We all scrutinize them. Why would you let your engineers build something themselves without harnessing that power of crowds? Security is one of the main reasons that businesses choose open source, and it's a really solid reason. Perhaps you're here this morning to be entertained by a lovely, light-hearted keynote. I'd like to warn you that I'm going to ask you to take on some tasks as we go through this. When I think about open source and business, I see one big weakness, and it's that businesses don't know what they have. I am going to ask you to be part of changing that. We need to inventory our code. We need to educate ourselves, our colleagues, the rest of the business about open source, about licensing, about what the licenses mean and how we should comply with them. Ivan has an OSPO, Open Source Program Office, so we have people who understand the licensing, can advise us on publishing packages, consuming packages. They also employ engineers that contribute upstream. It's a huge amount of fun. And that hugely helps. If you are not already hearing about the SBOM, Software Bill of Materials, you're very likely to hear about it this year. We need to secure our software supply chains. We need to have a really good handle on which software we're using, what we have, what version of things we have, even when their dependencies way up the tree. One way to do the SBOM is to use a standard called SPDX. You've probably already seen this in code. It's a machine-readable comment on the first line that describes the license in every file. So you've probably seen this. When you standardize on that, there's tooling to help you. It's an ISO standard. It is intentionally business-friendly, and it allows businesses to have assurances about their supply chain. And if you are publishing packages, if you are a supplier, it allows you to give those assurances and be part of your customers' setup and assurance. I've mentioned the OpenSSF here, so that's the Open Source Security Foundation. It's reasonably new. It grew out of some previous initiatives. It's under the Linux Foundation umbrella. I love what they are doing in terms of both tooling and also, like, what even is this? Really good educational resources that you can share with different types of colleagues. Educating ourselves and bringing things to our organizations and helping them to take advantage is super important. Now, it's important for the business because things will happen. Log4j, things happen, and that's going to happen. But you need to know what you have, and you need to know how to react. The other thing that's going to happen, things will happen, like Log4j. I'm only picking on it because it's a recent big news story, and you probably heard about it. There are others every day. And sometimes that can lead to the perception that open source isn't the best software. Open source maybe has issues. Know what you have, keep it updated, help your business understand how to responsibly consume open source and to keep themselves safe from these kinds of incidents. I'd like to tackle some myths, some legends, some fairy tales that I hear about open source. The first one is a story of a noble individual. This person is very talented and very dedicated. They labor alone to create incredible code, and they contribute it to open source for the good of us all. I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that person isn't making open source. We make open source. The good news is that person isn't making open source. We make open source. Open source is made by somebody with coffee in one hand pushing a fix or a docs update while they're in a boring video call meeting. Like it is, we are all one fragment of the myth of the noble individual. They exist, but they're a mirage of all of our contributions put together. And I feel we need to recognize that, even if we don't immediately see ourselves there. The truth of open source is that it's made here. The other myth I'd like to tackle is kind of the same myth from a different angle. And it's about businesses that contribute to open source. They're so generous. They're so philanthropic. Think of the businesses that you know that are big contributors to open source. Generous? Or just really good business? Right. Businesses do this because it makes sense for them, because there's a lot of benefits in being involved in the projects that you rely on, in ensuring the health of the ecosystem that you depend on, in having more developers engaged with the kind of technology that you do, or that you hope your customers will do, right? None of the businesses who are involved in open source are doing it out of generosity, and nor will your businesses. We're sometimes very coy about, doing the right thing and generously contributing to open source in our spare time. No, this is good business. Business makes money out of open source software. It's an important part of how our economy works. And we are part of that story. Let's not be shy about talking about it. And it's not just the dependencies that we build our applications on. It's also the tools that we use. Open source tooling is best in class. It's built by many hands. It's flexible. But it makes all of you and me more employable. Because we're all using the best standard tools. Your skills are transferable. Some of you, I know, have been doing this long enough to remember when every company, or maybe even every project, had its own special sauce for build scripts and all the rest of it. And it was really hard to onboard a new engineer to your team. Open source tooling, we've talked about the security side, but it makes us more effective. It gives us more options for changing projects, maybe even changing jobs. The cloud is inherently open source. Imagine building everything that's in your continuous integration tool chain by hand, right? You're gonna take a server, put it somewhere, install and maintain it, poll a source control repo, probably on the same server, for those of you who were there at this sort of time. Right, yeah, we used to wait a whole minute to know there was even a build to run before it started. You're going to maintain all of that tooling, you're going to write all of that tooling. Why would you do that? Open source means we don't have to. And it powers up the work that we're doing and lets us focus just on the interesting bits. It's very valuable. It's only very valuable because we make it very valuable. You have to know that you are welcome to be part of making it valuable. I'm going to ask you to consider yourself a stakeholder in every tool that you use, in every library that you depend on. If you see a bug, think about what you would do if this bug was in your code. Why is it different when it's in our code? I still want you to report that bug. I still want you to try to fix that bug. It should be considered part of your day job to fix that bug. But to do that, your employer would need to have clear policies on whether they even allow that or encourage that. And that's missing in lots of organizations. Some have outdated policies that are still in place that don't allow you to contribute. That's less common now. It was really common about 10 years ago. It's less common now. Lots of companies just don't have a policy at all. And maybe you could consider that to be like permission of a kind. But I recommend that you raise this and you get those policies put in place. I've shared a link with a bunch of resources. There are some templates to help you. You might think this isn't your job. Maybe it belongs to somebody further up your org chart. No, this is for you to ask the question and put in place the things you need to be one small piece of the really big picture. We need policies on how we may engage, and we need policies on how we may publish. Lots of organizations do solve problems that probably other organizations face. It's brilliant if you could get permission to publish that as open source. But go a step further and put policies in place that explain to you and you to your organization how that code will be maintained, who looks after it. Because none of us will do our current jobs forever. Teaching your employer to be a good open source maintainer, actually it's probably a whole other talk, but we can do it, but we need to think about it and we need to have that business paperwork in place. PHP is a grown-up industry now, and we can tackle these things and be part of a really important story. It's not just about fixing bugs or pushing code upstream. When you report a bug, build an integration, patch the docs, write a blog post. You're part of that project, you're part of that ecosystem, and you are choosing in the most direct way possible to support that open source project. I've been an open source project maintainer for absolutely years on different projects. Just your bug report, even more your docs patch, means so much to those projects, even the big ones. You're making a bigger difference than I think I could articulate to you. So find a way to make it happen. One thing we get from engaging with these open source projects, they might be a bit different from your work projects. It's a good thing. The open source project processes have much to teach us. I've worked remotely by choice for more than a decade. I don't live in London. I borrow from those workflows all the time. All of us have been remote, not necessarily by choice, in the last couple of years. Open source is designed for this. It is designed for distributed, asynchronous, frankly unreliable volunteer contributors. The way that those projects are set up, discussions are very disciplined, they're kept with their issues or their pull requests. The documentation is built to welcome newcomers and quickly allow new users to onboard. I think we have a lot to learn from those projects. And again, the experience of being part of those projects benefits what you do in your daily work as well. I give a whole other keynote about how open source is incredible for your career. I will attempt to not insert that entire talk into this slide. But to summarize, I would say open source is incredible for learning new tech skills. More than once, I've skilled myself up for a project that I knew was coming, perhaps the job I hoped I'd have next. I'm not advocating that you should all leave your jobs immediately. That would be awful. But it hasn't hurt, let's put it that way. I've made connections. I've met people that I've collaborated with on open source and then known who to go to if I had a question about this or something related that I knew they also knew. They know my username, right? They know me by GitHub handle, and we've got that connection already. The other thing that I learned in open source is the soft skills. I call them the hard skills. I'm now doing quite a senior role. I run a documentation project. Important people in the organization and outside it enthusiastically contribute absolutely terrible pull requests. And I have the skills to deal with that in a way that they are delighted to have feedback and keen to update their pull request with their new features. I didn't learn those skills in the workplace. I learned them on the internet, working with all sorts of people, with all sorts of different contexts, and figuring ways to work with those people and be constructive and all harness the same energy. When you work in open source, you gain all sorts of skills. Some of them you don't know you're gaining. I couldn't have told you this story at the beginning, for sure. And we know that open source contributors tell us that their open source activities and experience makes them more employable. And sometimes they'll move employers and bring their projects and interests with them. We talked earlier about the myth of the noble individual. Actually, about half of open source contributors are paid for at least some of the open source contributions that they make. It's quiet, but open source is really good business. And it's something that's available to all of us, and we can expect from our employers when we are benefiting their interests. Don't just work around an upstream bug. Fix it. I mean, you might need to work around it until they do their release, whatever. At least report it. If you check the list of resources, I've linked the How to Report Bugs Effectively essay. It's an old one, but it's still very good, and that is an important skill, especially when you're working with people that you don't know or that you don't share a context with. I have a question for you. How do you feel about doing some work at work that is part of something bigger and making those open source contributions? I get that opportunity, and I feel pretty good about it. And I think that's true of a lot of engineers, that it's really fun to collaborate on the things that we know and we rely on, and to be part of those projects that we use so much. I mean, it's almost a perk for employees, and it's much better than some of the perks I've been offered in the workplace, frankly. Employee wellness program, anyone? And the connections that you make are so much more valuable than having to pay the recruiter's fees when you need a new hire. And when I think about the contributions that I've made at work and the teams that I've worked with here at Ivan, as well as at other previous employers, there's something amazing about also doing the bigger work with your team. Making things together gives us a shared purpose and really bonds us together. There's a bunch of people in this room that I've built code with, and it gives us something together. I love that within a team, and it means that you sort of shake up your usual structure of who tells who what to do. You pick the issue you want to work on. Maybe you're working in a different configuration to usual. Maybe you're collaborating with somebody different, especially if you work in a bigger organization and you can mix the teams up. You don't even really need permission for this, right? Put a long meeting in an afternoon and call it Collaboration Summit. You are good. And you will do more in those 2 hours together as a team than you would achieve in most of the other uses of 2 hours that I can think of. Open source brings us together, and you can make a big difference to the projects that you depend on. Have a bug blitz for your pet project or something that you use a lot. There's an extra funny benefit to doing this. And it's a very sustainable kind of thing. I don't think it's just me, but when I have spent time setting up a project locally, I've seen what's on their issue backlog, maybe I'm already a committer or I've got a pull request open. You know, if I'm waiting for something to build, probably gonna just have another look at their issue queue, replicate a bug, answer a question. That's a big one. Maintainers shouldn't have to answer all the questions. Users get stuck on all sorts of things, and all of us can help. Have a blog post linked in the resources about how a bystander can contribute in a big way to the maintenance of a repository, even without commit access. So we can all be part of the story, but best of all, we can be part of a story with our team, moving forward the project that the business needs. It's more than just your hobby. It's something that you can really do and be a force for good. This is the last thing I'm going to ask you to do. Find a way to let your business, your employer, like some of you run businesses, be part of this story. It's of benefit to the business to contribute to the ecosystem, to be on the inside, maybe to drive a feature or join that conversation, to have healthier dependencies that we can rely on, and that if something does happen, will be updated quickly and in the right way. There are lots of ways that a business can make an impact, but you are the catalyst. You can offer whatever your business does. Maybe give a little bit of time. There are plenty of organizations that are famous for 10% time or 20% time. Maybe you can find a way to get some time to just lend some of your skills to some of those upstream projects that you need, or some of the integrations or tools that you're working with. You can offer whatever you do as a business. Ivan offers cloud database services, so we have quite a few open source projects that we're supporting. We're just paying their hosting bills, their CI runs against our Kafka, that sort of thing. It's important to us. Our customers love it, because then they know that this thing works with our platform, because it does every time the build runs. It's very tangible. It's not expensive in business terms, but it's very, very impactful. I've got Tidelift on the screen. This is worth a look for businesses. It's very business friendly, right? Founded by lawyers. Your people can talk to their people. It's very digestible in a way that like a Patreon or something isn't always. Tidelift will make legal and financial agreements with businesses, identify their dependencies, and then make legal and financial agreements with the maintainers as well. If you are a maintainer, you might want to check it out. If enough people are using your project, you have the option to engage with them and get some support financially in return for agreeing an issue response time or whatever. So that's a very interesting one. I think we'll see more in this space, but I think it's pretty new right now. There are so many other ways, particularly financially, that your business can support open source, and that you can support open source as well. I've picked a few. This is not an exhaustive list. Please tweet me the things that should have been here, and we'll just keep on changing it around if I give the talk again. I'll also add them to the list of resources. I mentioned the OSI right at the beginning. The open source initiative is the custodian of the open source definition. They're an incredible bunch of humans looking out for us in the most understated way imaginable, and we need them. You can be a corporate supporter, you can be an individual supporter. I've been an individual supporter since they introduced individual supportering, whenever that was. I mentioned the OpenSSF before, Open Source Security Foundation. They're under the Linux Foundation, and I think they're doing amazing things to help businesses secure their tool chain and to bring more grown-up practice to the area. If you have a business that has code security rules that make open source difficult, OpenSSF will be the bridge and that's with education and information and resources and advice, as well as just bringing people together, although that as well. Since I'm in London, I cannot not mention OpenUK. OpenUK is a UK-based, not-for-profit, which looks to further open data, open hardware, and open source software in the UK. So they are working on a bunch of initiatives, lobbying for the right legal frameworks, running some education. They're supporting startups with founder workshops. Your employers can be corporate sponsors. This stuff is important. They also have ambassadors. I'm an OpenUK ambassador. Please come and talk to me about that if you're interested. Finally, the PHP Foundation, which is late on so many levels, but it's a new initiative to help businesses support development of PHP. We've got a really rich history of businesses donating servers and employees and bits and pieces, but it's been very ad hoc. The PHP Foundation brings those things together and gives us ways to handle the money and make that work. It's early days. I know Derek's been part of the discussions, and he's promised me that you can go to him with questions. I am not the right person for that. Open source and business come together in a powerful way that lets us all do what we do. But you are the magic ingredient that makes those things happen. Go back to the office on Monday, inventory your code, make sure you know what you have. Put the policies in place. Encourage contributions, make sure everyone knows what they may do or may not do if that's appropriate, and how to publish code if that's okay. Bring the business to the party. Start showing them ways that they can get involved and be insiders and be part of this movement, because the benefits are there. There's a famous essay, it's another old one, called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It became a book. You may have read it. I've linked it. To summarize in a really brutal way for a great piece of writing, when you build a cathedral, there's a plan. You lay the foundation stones, you know how big it's going to be at the start, someone's got a vision, and we're all working towards the same thing. The bazaar is not like that. It starts on a crossroads, everyone brings their own rug, somebody's selling food, somebody's selling handbags, like whatever. Open source is the bazaar. It's not like it is on purpose, it's just what we made of it. And all of you need to bring your rug and figure out what you're going to sell and where your space is going to be. And we're going to make an amazing, colorful, successful cacophony of contributions to open source, both in code and in the impact that we enable and that we encourage other people to have. I hope I've given you some ideas. Pick something and make it happen. Thanks very much.